Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me again. Today, I'm going to take another stab at interviewing, and once again, I'm going to be tackling the issue of economics and free trade in particular. And so I've reached out to another economist acquaintance of mine to shed some light on this subject for us. This time, I'm speaking to a fellow Canadian and fellow Quebecer, Mr. Vincent Geloso,
Bonjour.
a
Hello.
veteran of economics at the London School of Economics. Vincent, thanks a lot for joining me today. Why don't we start by having you just tell us a little bit about yourself, particularly your credentials and what you do now?
Right now, I'm on a job market as an economist. I've just finished my PhD in economic history at the London School of Economics. My field of expertise is Canadian economic history. A lot of focus on international trade and integration of markets over space and time.
How would you describe your overall outlook on economic issues?
It's not so much that I like market a lot, it's that I always believe that the alternative is worse. Markets are very much imperfect, but government intervention sometimes makes a solution which is more problematic than the problem itself. So it's not that there's kind of a market utopia as much as there is a series of government failures that are worse than having people free to discover the correct way to organize economic activity. And generally, my intuition has been, and this is kind of as an outlook, is the fact that people have a greater incentive to discover their errors and correct them when it's their money, their time, their lives at stake, than when it's a politician's time and not his money and only his re-election chances. So basically, it's kind of in terms of error correction mechanisms, markets are incredibly efficient. Governments are much less so. So these views are especially important in international trade.
So it's not so much that markets are magical or perfect, or that they always lead to the best outcome, or at least to a perfect outcome, but on balance, they tend to be a better way to organize economic activity.
This is where words are very important. I really believe that markets are better. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. Saying that markets are best to organize economic activity, scarce resources, doesn't mean that it's perfect. It's never close to our perfect textbook optimal equilibriums. It's far from it, but it's much better. Not only that, is that people are very good at trying to improve the situation by innovation, by new technologies, by new organizational schemes to produce goods and services. And it's incredible how much people have incentives to discover better ways to organize economic activity overall. And the virtue of that is especially since there's a lot of information that's lying around and people discover it. And sometimes they discover that, oh, I have this piece of information, you have this piece of information. Let's form a business and we'll see if we can, produce a good that people actually do want. The real thing about markets is that there's not a free market utopia. There's a series of free market arguments for why lives are better under freer markets than under very regulated markets. But this case is really hinged on the fact that competition is a discovery process for which you improve the way you organize because you have an incentive to discover errors and correct them.
So, as you know, I've spent most of the past decade living and either going to school or working in the United States. And I've become really involved in the libertarian movement while I was there. And I'm fond of telling my American friends that I grew up in one of the most left-wing societies in North America, if not the most left-wing. So, what's it like advocating for a more market-oriented approach to economics in such a collectivist political culture?
The thing is, Quebec they're left-wing on economics, but they're very much socially liberal. So in the sense of leaving people alone in private lives to some extent. There's this quote by Jamie White. He's a British philosopher who was originally from New Zealand. And when he was asked how to describe New Zealand, he said they're broad-minded fascists. I'm not saying that this applies to Quebec, but broad-minded is the case. So generally, on a lot of social issues, they're very much willing to listen to free market arguments. But when it comes to economics, it's incredibly hard to explain why regulations tend to worsen things, why free trade is good, why if you have to tax, consumption taxes are better than corporate and income taxes. It's very hard to explain it. So they're very generally a libertarian would be happy here in terms of how people view social policies. Not perfectly happy, but happier than he would be in the United States. But on economics, it's incredibly hard to have libertarian orientations here in Quebec because it is the France of North America without the Parisians, basically.
That's a good way to put it. It's interesting. Now, you and I first met at a conference here in Montreal, hosted by the Fraser Institute, which is Canada's premier free market think tank, about 7 years ago. And that's interesting. Right, there you go. It's been a while.
I got my hair.
We go way back. One piece of research that I've heard from Fraser, among other sources, that's been making the rounds in the liberty movement the past few years is the finding that Canada actually scores somewhat better overall in measures of economic freedom than the United States does. So
yeah.
Do the data that you've seen bear that out? And if so, in what particular areas does Canada have the advantage over the U.S. in that domain?
Okay, this is where economic freedom index are very hard to use. It's not that they're bad, it's that you have to be aware of how you're using them. Economic freedom index weigh a whole wide range of different policies. It can't capture perfectly the extent of especially regulation-wise. So they do try to capture for regulation, but regulations are incredibly hard to measure because if you say the regulation says you can't sell this way, and in the United States you say you can't sell it that way, which one is more stringent, which one is more of an impediment on the way to operate markets, it's hard to measure. There are ways. So we have like word density index and regulations. We try to do stuff like that in regulatory codes, how many pages there are in federal registers, fiscal code size. There's a lot of ways we try, but when you look at this and you exclude all the other indicators of regulation that are not regulation related, Canada is actually doing slightly better. So on a lot of them, sometimes it's equal to the United States, sometimes it's a little lower, sometimes it's a little higher. But the one where Canada has a great advantage is regulation. Regulations in Canada are incredibly simple. And this is why I think the biggest difference between Canada and the United States is that if you have a welfare state in Canada, you don't have it in the United States, but in the United States, you have a series of regulations that are hampering the market in very pernicious, small, and not like individually, there are small cogs in the machine, and you don't really notice it individually. But once you take the sum of these regulations, they're incredibly annoying, especially in the financial sector. They create very perverse incentives, and Canada, in that sense, does not have that. And I think that's one of the reasons Canada scores better on economic freedom index.
That's really interesting. I mean, I would say there's a perception to different degrees on both sides of the border that Canada, on the whole, at least, is a more statist society, more left-wing on the whole, with a more generous welfare state on the whole.
No, not even historically. Canada is very conservative, historically speaking. Just look at banking regulations. Canada had, for the longest part of its history, free banking. So basically, banks only, the sole really big regulation banks had to face was that for every loan they made, they had to get a certain capital inside. So the owners of the banks had to have capital, they had to have skin in the game. That was the only big regulation. Otherwise, banks in Canada were free to issue their own liability, so their own bank notes for a very long time. They were allowed to some point, merge together within the market. So you had in Canada, by the time of the Great Depression, you didn't have like tons of banks. You had 6 or 7 strong national banks, which were very well diversified. And when the Great Depression came, no banks in Canada failed. Unlike the United States, where, and this is the biggest difference, in the United States, you had unit branch regulations where if you were a state bank from Iowa, you could not open another bank in Idaho or Utah. You had to create another company and you couldn't move assets easily between them. In Canada, you could be a bank from Montreal and you could invest in Nova Scotia, you could invest in British Columbia, nobody cared. So you had very well integrated banks that diversified risks nationally, while in the United States, because of the unit branch regulation, which was very weird and very hard to defend economically, created banks that were very localized, didn't have diversified balance sheets, and failed very easily. So just on banking regulation, Canada always had freer financial markets and much closer to what people call in economics free banking, nearly unregulated banking. And it was actually a very stable system. It was very unprone to financial crisis. Canada resisted very easily shocks in money demand and it was very, very resilient. That actually tells you a lot about Canada as a free marketplace historically. But even if you look at institutions like the Bank of Canada, only appeared in the 1930s, while the Federal Reserve of the United States appeared in the 1910s. While there was the New Deal in the United States, provincial premiers, like the one in Quebec, actually. Quebec used to be the most conservative place, socially conservative. It moved to be socially liberal, but it used to be very socially conservative and economically conservative. So at one point, Premier Taschereau of Quebec came out and said, this is a socialist plan by a socialist president in the United States. And that's how he called Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this was considered prevailing opinion in Canada. Canada had a very, very strong history of smaller government, very limited regulation. But like the United States, it had a strong history of protectionism, of putting a lot of restrictive barriers on imports, especially for the benefit of Ontario, the biggest province. So it's a mixed bag, obviously. But overall, everything that is trade related, Canada was very similar to the United States. Everything else, Canada was always the smaller government type than the United States. To a very large extent, Canada was a very, very conservative place. Overall, Canada is probably misrepresented as a lefty country, and I think that's only an artifact of the 1960s and 70s with the Trudeau government, which was clearly left-leaning. But otherwise than that, Canada has a very strong heritage of freer, not free markets.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the issue of the 60s and 70s because, of course, Canada adopted its single-payer healthcare system in the 1960s, and I think that's contributed a lot to that perception. Given that Canada has a single-payer healthcare system, and yet, on the whole, its economy is found by many to be freer than that of the United States, what do you think that says about what kind of inspiration Americans could draw from Canada? Would you say it's the U.S. could adopt, in some ways at least, a more generous social safety net while still maintaining a position as a free market economy and without doing too much damage to personal liberty?
Okay, there's two things. The first thing is a historical correction I have to make. There is no single-payer healthcare in Canada. There's 10 different single-payer healthcare in the different provinces. The only federal law that exists is the Canadian Healthcare Act, which says that if provinces move towards privatization of their healthcare services, like to charge fees, they will cut federal transfers to the provinces, health-related transfers. So all the provinces have 10 very different ways of organizing their healthcare system. So that's the first thing. It's an important nuance to make. The second thing that ought to be mentioned is the fact that overall in Canada, this is something nobody gets, and it drives me nuts. You can have redistribution, you can have some level of welfare, and it does not imply intervention in markets. You have to separate these debates aggressively. Market regulation is about altering the way resources are allocated. Redistribution is after the outcome of the market is done, we retransfer to the poorest to assure that they get some form of, basic living standards. These two debates are very different. I can argue for freer markets, small government, lower taxes, and still argue, for example, for medical savings account, school vouchers, kindergarten vouchers. You can make this argument. They're two very separate topics. I can divorce my libertarian views on welfare policy from my libertarian views on regulatory policy and tax policy. Canada's problem, to a very high extent, the easy gains, the low-hanging fruits for economic growth in Canada are regulation-related, not welfare-related. In the United States, it's for policymakers, since there's so many small regulation everywhere, and each is very hard to attack individually, the low-hanging fruits for policymakers is basically welfare policy. So it's where you should target, in terms of political capital, in terms of where the effort would be the best in terms of economic growth. Canada would be reducing a lot of its government spending to make room, to reduce government spending in welfare policy by introducing market mechanism and then reducing taxes. The United States would gain much more by reducing regulations dramatically that they have. But politically speaking, for every unit of political capital that is spent, if you want, in the United States, it's much cheaper to attack welfare policy than it is to attack regulation. And in Canada, it's the reverse. It's much cheaper to attack regulations, politically speaking, than social programs. So it's kind of a very weird situation.
I wanted to turn really quickly to the issue of free trade, which we keep hearing about in the current U.S. presidential election. One thing I've noticed is that you hear so much about outsourcing and shipping of jobs overseas south of the border. But I find in Canada, in this country's body politic, I almost never hear anything about that. Is that because Canada has not actually lost many, if any, manufacturing jobs to outsourcing? Or is it because that's happening to an extent in the Canadian economy, but Canadians don't feel the pinch from it as much because of the various provinces' social safety nets? What's going on here?
Okay, there's a lot going on, and it's hard to get a clear answer on this. So first of all, I think just by virtue of the fact that we're only 30 million, well, a little more than 30 million. And the United States has this long history of being a superpower, and we are, the noisy neighbor, the noisy, annoying small neighbor. I think Canadians have accepted that in political affairs and world politics, they're never going to matter that much. So when they see jobs going overseas, they kind of accept it as kind of a consequence of being a small country. There is less political points to be made from harping on this issue because I think Canadians really, for some reason, don't seem to care that much. But there is still some debate on that in Canada. There was a debate on the hollowing out of Canadian businesses and Canadian social seats. It happens. It's just much less intense than in the United States. The main reason is that Canada, I think this is where it's very important, with the exception of Quebec, because French speakers are very less prone to being bilingual, move very easily across Canada. So there's a lot of changes across provinces, and labor markets, to some extent, are not extensively regulated. That is one good thing about Canada. Union power is strong, but there is some extent of mobility across provinces. So you'll see a lot of people going from Nova Scotia, from New Brunswick to Alberta when the oil boom was going on. I think that was one of the reasons that probably there's less aggressivity towards it. I think it's also, maybe I'm hoping that Canadians understand that offshoring jobs is actually a good thing, that you're actually saving resources this way, and that you end up with more money in your pocket at the end of the month so that you can consume more. I hope that's the reason that there's less traction, but that's hopeful and not probably true.
So the outsourcing is happening, at least to some extent, in Canada's economy, but for reasons peculiar to Canada's body politic, there's just not as much of a brouhaha about it.
Yeah, you said it much better than I did. That was much simpler.
I try. So really my last question is, and this is, not just in Canada, but in, I would say, industrialized countries in general. Is it even possible for governments, at least in democratic countries, to prevent companies from engaging in outsourcing? Are there really any policy tools, any non-authoritarian policy tools by which governments could actually tell companies, you're not going to ship these American or British or Canadian jobs to Mexico or China or Brazil?
I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's desirable. Regardless of the direction, both parties are winners. So one way or another, you end up with a gain. If I get to have Mexican assets, it's returns to me. We're not poor because we made a trade with foreigners. If we buy shoes from a company in Trois-Rivières, or we buy one from Mexico, it doesn't matter at the end of the month. It's which allows me to keep the most in my pocket. And if I'm trading with the Mexican guy and I'm saving some money because of that, it means I have more assets down the line, and I'm probably investing in more productive plant because my savings will go towards the most productive firm. And if the most productive firms are in Mexico, I will reap a part of these earnings and I'll be a big winner. So people are not getting this. However, there can be trade diversion because of regulation. So you can imagine it theoretically with two countries with no regulations. At period one, country A is better at producing X and country B is better at producing Y. And then just because of regulation, you create kind of a wedge between the product where everybody decides to produce X in country B, even though country A is better at it. But then the problem is not the offshoring of jobs because of that. The problem is the unnatural trade diversion that was caused by regulations. And that is something a few people want to denounce and care about. If you really believe you can have more jobs in the United States or even Canada, the issue you should ask yourself, which regulations are preventing us from competing with competitors from other countries? That should be the only question at ease. But international trade, offshoring per se is not bad. It's actually a good thing, but only if it's not caused by artificial diversions because of regulations and taxes that are making us less competitive relative to the other guy.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for clearing all that up for us, Vincent. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to have this conversation with me. And
That was appreciated.
Absolutely, and I look forward to many, many more such conversations. I love to pick my friends' brains. So, you know, stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for my next big interview. Hopefully, you've all learned something from this.
Cheers.
Cheers, and to liberty. Take care.
Same to you.